In this video clip, I'm going to give a very short overview of some theories of motivation at work. Now, in a sense, you could argue that theories of motivation are the most important things that managers need to know. Within any organisation, after all, we have a variety of different people who are doing a variety of different things. And in order to be a successful manager, you might assume what you have to do is to motivate those people to work well at whatever their jobs are. So in a very simplistic sense then, finding the key to motivating human beings could be the best theory of management that there is. The problem, however, is that there isn't one theory of motivation. There are 143 different theories of motivation, and they all say different things about human beings. They fall into very broad categories, but most of these theories do have a kind of intuitive appeal. When you hear a theory of motivation for the first time, most people tend to agree with it. They can see the sense in that particular theory. But once we start to probe any of these theories, what we seem to find is that none of them are entirely adequate in understanding the complexity of human beings. Now, the simplest and, in a sense, the first theory of motivation comes from Frederick Taylor. I'm sure you remember Frederick Taylor's theories of scientific management basically proposed what we should be doing is controlling people with money. And he saw money as the most important motivator. All the rest of the stuff was pretty much fluff. It was down to various different kinds of job design and all the rest of it. But the way to get employees engaged was to give them money. Based on the idea, I suppose, that everyone has their price, and if you pay people enough, they will do pretty much anything you want them to. Well, that's true, in a sense. It's certainly true. People usually go to work for money, and they usually like to have lots of money when they're at work. However, it doesn't seem to account for people's enthusiasms and commitments at work. Simply motivating people with money can get people to work, but it can't necessarily produce people who work enthusiastically. Because however much money you give someone, if they're working in a dull and demeaning job, they're extremely unlikely to feel motivated to carry on doing that job. So most of the interesting and more complex theories of motivation treat money as one component, but certainly not the only component of how to motivate people. A very nice and neat theory of workplace motivation comes to us from Maslow. Maslow was a humanistic psychologist writing in America in the 1940s and 50s, and he came up with this idea of the motivational triangle. At the base of the triangle, you have very rudimentary forms of motivation, which are associated with the imperative to keep warm, to be fed, and so on. And then the higher up the triangle we go, the more sophisticated the needs become. The needs towards the top are needs for creativity, for inspiration, for good colleagues and friendship, and so on. So what Maslow is essentially saying in this hierarchy is that if we satisfy the lower needs, then in a sense we are providing some of the basic forms of motivation that human beings need at work, but in order to get them really enthusiastic about what they're doing, you have to satisfy human higher needs as well. Maslow's triangle is probably one of the most influential management theories globally. You find it in virtually every single textbook. But despite its, again, intuitive appeal, it's a theory of motivation that has some serious flaws. We think about the idea of sacrifice, for example, of somebody working very, very hard, perhaps damaging their health or not seeing their family and so on. This would be a form of behaviour that's incomprehensible in terms of the Maslow hierarchy of need, because according to Maslow, you can't violate lower needs in order to satisfy higher ones. These needs are supposed to be arranged hierarchically. So other psychologists and management theorists have come up with slightly different formulations, but based on very similar sorts of ideas. Frederick Herzberg, another very famous influential theorist, put forward the idea that motivators can be divided into broadly two categories. On the one hand, you have what he called the hygiene factors. Hygiene factors essentially tries to refer to a category of motivators which are to do with fairly rudimentary physical needs. So that you need to be paid well, you need to be in a warm office, you need to be to have a manager who doesn't bully you, and so on. Yeah, so you have this idea of a category of motivators that are essentially about the rudimentary basics of being at work. However, Herzberg says, in themselves, these things don't motivate. What these things do is to provide the grounds upon which motivation can then happen. If we want to look at how motivation happens, he suggests you need to look at more intrinsic factors, more motivating factors. And these, he suggests, are things like achievement, advancement, recognition, growth, and so on. So the more interpersonal aspects of being at work. To summarise this, and to a certain extent to summarise Maslow too, what you have is the idea that, if I take an example, simply having a warm office won't motivate you in itself. But if you have a very cold office, you will be demotivated. So it is necessary as a manager to make sure that all your employees have warm offices, that they're not distracted by being cold or hungry or whatever it is, but that in itself won't motivate them. To be motivated, they need also to have the opportunity for creativity, for advancement, for recognition, for all those kinds of human needs at work. Now, very broadly, in terms of theories of motivation, what we can see is that Maslow and Herzberg pretty much shaped ideas about what motivation was and how it worked, pretty much through the 20th century. In a way, what Maslow and Herzberg have done is actually quite simple, because they've described motivation in terms of two different features, things that might demotivate you and things that might motivate you. But what's interesting about both Herzberg and Maslow's approaches is that these are kind of universalistic approaches. They are put forward as approaches which apply to everybody, everywhere, all the time. An odder, and for me, much more interesting version of motivation theory comes to us from the improbably named Victor Vroom. He put forward something he called expectancy theory. And expectancy theory is based much more on the idea that individuals themselves might have different expectations of motivation at work. Vroom expresses his theory as a rather neat equation, EV equals M. This can be unpacked as the idea that motivation is a result of your expectancy, the attitude that you have towards a particular thing, multiplied by your desire for that particular thing. And that will produce a motivation. So, to give an example, if I really want to get promotion, and I believe that certain forms of activity will get me promotion, then I'll be very motivated at work to try and get that promotion. However, if I really want a promotion, but simply don't think that this work organisation can provide me with a promotion, then I won't be motivated to try and get a promotion. The point being that either if your expectancy to get something is zero, or your desire to get something is zero, you will not be motivated. Now, if we think about this equation for a minute, essentially what it's saying is that if people want something and think they can get it, then they will be motivated. But both wanting something and knowing that you can get something are essentially social issues. These are questions that will differ depending on particular work organisations and on particular people. So, despite the fact that Vroom is expressing motivation as if it were a neat equation, what that neat equation actually shows us is that motivation is a highly complex and variable issue. So, going back to what I was saying at the start then, if we knew the keys to the human soul, we would be fantastic managers. We would be brilliant managers because we would be capable of manipulating people, of making them do exactly what we wanted them to do under any circumstances. However, in work, just as in life, we don't understand what other people want. And no form of theorising is going to allow us access to people's souls or their brains. So motivation theory should only be taken as a general guide, as a way of thinking about some of the theories that have been expressed to understand people at work. It certainly can't, and I would suggest never can, become a predictive theory that would allow the manager to know how to influence their employees successfully.